A storm of hooves tore through the narrow mountain pass, each thundering step shaking the earth, as if the Andes themselves were crying out. Between the rising dust and the scent of sweat and blood, a man stumbled, his cries swallowed by the wind. Limbs twisted in agony, he struggled against the inevitability, against a fate carved not by chance but by cruelty. Villagers had whispered warnings for months, tales of those who defied authority, only to vanish into shadows of terror. Now before their eyes a brutal lesson unfolded. Resistance came at a cost written in flesh and echoing across valleys. This was no ordinary punishment. It was a calculated warning, an atrocity meant to imprint fear into every heart. Tonight, you will witness the story of Diego Valverde, the rebel who dared defy colonial power, and the horrific end that would haunt Peru for generations. Would you have survived this? High in the Peruvian Andes, villages clung to jagged ridges, carved from stone and mist where the air was thin and the wind carried both whispers and warnings. It was in one such village in 1742 that Diego Valverde earned his reputation. He was no ordinary man. His defiance was measured, deliberate, and terrifyingly effective. He moved among the villagers with quiet purpose, helping indigenous laborers escape excessive tributes and speaking against the corruption of colonial officials. His eyes, dark and calculating, were said to pierce through falsehood, unsettling even the most hardened soldiers. Diego's courage was matched by the tension that simmered around him. Villagers both admired and feared him, his very presence a spark in a powder keg of oppression. At night he would wander the slopes, the scent of pine and wet stone filling the cold air, listening to the distant rumble of cattle or the crack of a shepherd's staff against rock. The mountains seemed alive, attentive to the murmurs of rebellion and the tremors of coming punishment. The rebel's defiance reached its climax when he publicly challenged the local corregidor's decree. Diego demanded fairness for his people, refusing to bend under threats of arrest or worse. The corregidor's anger was swift and merciless, whispers of a punishment so brutal that even the hardened villagers shivered in anticipation began to circulate. Horses, instruments of both speed and destruction, were to be the medium through which Diego's defiance would be extinguished. Yet Diego did not show fear. Instead, he moved with deliberate calm, surveying the village square, noting exits and potential allies, his hands brushing the worn stone of walls he had grown up beside. Every gesture suggested awareness, a man bracing not just for survival, but for the preservation of his principles. And still, the distant rhythmic pounding of hooves began to creep into the valley, a sound that would become the heartbeat of terror. Diego's fate, though looming, was uncertain. Each villager wondered silently whether courage could survive cruelty. If you lived in this village, would you have stayed to watch or run into the mountains to escape what was coming? Tell me in the comments. Do you believe Diego's end was inevitable, or could he have survived if the winds of fate had shifted? The first shadow of hooves appeared over the ridge, and the valley held its breath. What came next would be a warning carved into history in the most horrific of ways. At the crest of the hill, the corregidor's manor stood like a dark sentinel over the scattered Andean villages, its stone walls absorbing the first light of dawn while casting long shadows across the valley. Within, the orders were precise, cold, and unwavering. Diego Valverde had crossed a line, and the punishment was to be both public and brutal, a spectacle designed to crush hope and instill obedience. The corregidor summoned mounted enforcers, men trained not just in riding but in the discipline of fear. Their horses snorted and pawed at the ground, muscles coiled like springs, as if aware of the violence they were about to unleash. By mid-morning, the riders assembled in the village square, the smell of leather, horse sweat, and damp straw hanging heavy in the air. Villagers peered cautiously from shuttered windows or behind rock walls, hearts pounding. Mothers pressed children to their chests. Fathers gripped tools too small to defend against cavalry. Diego was brought forward, his hands bound but his posture unbroken. There was a flicker of defiance in his dark eyes, a silent challenge to authority that made some gasp and others turn away. The corregidor circled Diego slowly, inspecting him as if appraising a condemned animal. His voice, low and commanding, detailed the crime: defiance, aid to fugitives, insolence before the crown. He announced that the rebel would face a punishment designed to leave an imprint not only on Diego, but on the memories of every witness. The riders adjusted their reins, the sound of stirrups scraping stone like the warning of some ancient, implacable law. Diego's chest rose and fell steadily, the cool mountain wind carrying the faint tang of blood from earlier executions. Then came the order. The horses surged forward, hooves striking stone and earth with a deafening rhythm, a rolling tide of destruction. Diego staggered, a man caught between flesh and inevitability. Screams pierced the morning air as dust rose in choking clouds, masking the brutality unfolding below. The villagers' silence was thick with dread. They were watching history written in the most horrifying medium imaginable. For Diego, each moment was a battle between instinct and inevitability. Yet as the first blows struck, the valley seemed to shudder. Would defiance survive against the raw power of mounted authority? Or was this the end of a legend before it could fully form? Imagine this was your village. Would you have intervened or hidden behind stone and fear? Share your thoughts in the comments. Harita's shadow loomed larger than the rest as the sun climbed higher, and the earth beneath Diego trembled. What would follow next was destined to become a warning carved in agony. Diego Valverde's struggle ended abruptly, when the mounted enforcers corralled him at the base of the valley. His arms were seized, muscles burning, lungs heaving with cold mountain air, mixed with the acrid scent of sweat and dust. He had fought with every ounce of strength and cunning, yet against trained riders and relentless horses, he was now powerless. Around him, villagers crouched behind walls and stones, wide-eyed, their hearts drumming in their chests. The sound of hooves receded, replaced by the oppressive silence that often follows terror. The corregidor approached, his boots striking the cobbled ground in deliberate rhythm, each step echoing like a death knell. Diego's defiance remained, though tempered by exhaustion and a creeping awareness of the inevitability closing around him. "I have one choice," the corregidor announced, his voice carrying over the frozen crowd. "Submit fully and live to witness others punished, or face the consequences and die as an example." The villagers' breaths caught in unison. This was no ordinary execution. This was a meticulously orchestrated warning, a ritualized cruelty designed to imprint fear on the very bones of the Andes. Diego's mind raced, considering the impossible options. To submit would betray his principles, the very essence of his rebellion. To resist was to invite unimaginable suffering, not just for himself, but for those who might attempt defiance in the future. The wind whispered across the cliffs, carrying the faint scent of pine resin and iron, as though nature itself mourned the choice forced upon him. Diego's eyes swept over the villagers, some in admiration, some in horror, and he realized that his decision, though personal, was a message that would echo for generations. Finally, Diego's voice rose, steady and unwavering, refusing to yield. "If death is the price of justice, I will pay it," he said, and the silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Horses shifted, their hooves scraping against rock, nostrils flaring. The corregidor nodded, a grim satisfaction etched into his face, as though a lesson had been perfectly delivered. At that moment, time seemed to slow. The valley held its breath, waiting for the first strike, the initial chaos that would transform rebellion into warning. Villagers, torn between horror and fascination, could only watch, powerless to intervene. Would you have chosen to defy authority, even knowing what awaited, or would you have bent to save your life? Tell me in the comments, do you believe Diego's courage was heroic or foolhardy? Above the valley, the sun cast long, cruel shadows, and the pounding of hooves began again, closer this time. The final, terrible act was about to begin. The valley trembled as the horses closed in, their hooves hammering against stone and soil, a relentless drumbeat of impending horror. Diego Valverde's body was seized, limbs pinned by the weight of the riders and the sheer strength of the animals. Dust rose in choking clouds, stinging eyes and nostrils, carrying the metallic tang of blood already mingled with earth. The air seemed to thicken, a living thing pressing down on the villagers who dared to watch from behind shuttered windows and jagged rocks. Each heartbeat echoed like a drum in their ears, matching the rhythm of the pounding hooves. Diego's cries rang out, first a yell of shock, then a guttural scream of agony, as the horses tore at his body. The punishment was not swift. It was methodical, an unrelenting orchestration of cruelty. Every movement, every stomp, was intended to break him completely while leaving a permanent warning etched into the soil and memory of the villagers. His cloak, soaked in blood and sweat, whipped violently in the wind, a ragged banner of defiance that refused to lie still even in pain. Witnesses would later describe the surreal horror, the sun glaring off iron stirrups, the horses' muscles glistening with exertion, the valley alive with a sound that was part thunder, part anguish. The corregidor watched without flinching, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and cold calculation. He understood the message being sent. Rebellion, no matter how principled, carried consequences written in flesh. And yet, in the midst of chaos, a strange clarity seemed to settle over Diego. Even as his body was torn apart, his mind remained sharp, conscious of the story unfolding, aware that this violent spectacle would echo far beyond the valley. Every gasp, every snap of bone became a testament to defiance, a dark imprint that would haunt generations. For the villagers, the scene was unbearable yet compelling. Mothers pressed children tightly, fathers averted their gaze, but none could leave. The lesson had been delivered with absolute certainty. Disobedience invited terror, and cruelty could be both human and almost elemental in its execution. Would you have stayed to watch, or fled before the horror reached your home? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe this punishment was justice or an atrocity designed for fear? As the last echo of hooves faded and the dust slowly settled, a chilling silence fell over the valley. But the message of terror was far from over. The shadow of this brutal warning would linger, waiting for the next act of defiance. The aftermath of Diego Valverde's punishment was a silence so profound, it seemed to devour sound itself. The valley, once alive with the chatter of daily life and the bleating of sheep, now lay under a heavy shroud of dread. Villagers emerged cautiously from behind rocks, shutters and the scant trees that dotted the slopes. Their eyes were wide, reflecting horror and disbelief, as if the mountains themselves had conspired to deliver a lesson in terror. The scent of iron and mud lingered in the air, an invisible stain on every inhale, reminding them that rebellion had a price written in blood. Parents held children close, whispering stories of obedience and caution, while men whose hands once held tools now trembled at the memory of the hooves pounding Diego into the earth. Conversations were hushed. Even the wind seemed to whisper warnings through the jagged cliffs. Some villagers claimed they could see Diego's figure in the dust, his courage lingering in the flicker of sunlight across stone. Others insisted that the shadow of the horses remained, a phantom herd roaming the valley to remind them of the day defiance was crushed. Rumors spread quickly. Merchants returning from nearby towns told of officials praising the punishment as exemplary, while wandering priests murmured prayers for the soul of the fallen rebel. Diego's story became both a warning and a legend, whispered in alleys, markets, and fields. Fear settled like a second skin, shaping the villagers' behavior for years to come. Fields were worked more cautiously, voices softened, and compliance became not just expected, but instinctual. And yet, despite terror, sparks of admiration for Diego endured. Some youths, inspired by his defiance, secretly carried messages of resistance, keeping the memory alive even as the valley outwardly submitted. Diego had become more than a man. He had become a symbol, an echo of courage in a landscape dominated by fear. Would you have spoken out in secret, or lived quietly to survive? I want to hear your theory in the comments. Was Diego's sacrifice a warning, or a call to resistance that authorities failed to extinguish? As the sun dipped behind the peaks, long shadows crept across the valley, twisting and stretching like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in that growing darkness, the lesson of Diego's brutal end lingered, waiting for the next spark of defiance to ignite, or for the valley to forget entirely. In the weeks and months that followed Diego Valverde's gruesome end, the valley seemed suspended between reality and myth. His story spread not only through whispered conversations, but through acts of remembrance, a carving in a rock, a fleeting shadow of someone running through the fields, a chant quietly sung by children mimicking what they had heard from elders. The smell of the mountains, pine resin mixed with the lingering tang of iron from that fateful day, became inseparable from the memory of Diego's defiance. Travelers from neighboring villages recounted the horrors in hushed tones at taverns and markets. Some swore they glimpsed Diego's spirit on misty mornings, standing on the cliffs overlooking the village, a spectral warning to those tempted to challenge authority. Priests and officials alike found their sermons and proclamations overshadowed by the story of a man who had dared to resist and paid the ultimate price. Diego, though absent in body, remained vividly present in collective memory. The legend grew not just because of his death, but because of his refusal to submit. Scholars of the period later noted that public punishments were intended to extinguish hope, yet Diego's punishment did the opposite. It inspired courage in secret corners where whispers of rebellion persisted. Villagers who had witnessed his end passed down stories to their children, teaching that moral conviction sometimes demanded sacrifices that were terrifying and absolute. The very mountains seemed to echo his spirit, carrying stories across valleys, ensuring that fear and admiration coexisted. Even nature seemed to mourn him. Storms would break suddenly over the cliffs where he had fallen, as if the sky itself grieved injustice. The horses that had carried out the punishment were dispersed, but some claimed the sound of phantom hooves still echoed in the night wind, reminding the valley that authority and cruelty were not the only forces at play. Would you have dared to walk the path Diego once took, knowing his fate? Or would survival demand silence and submission? Tell me in the comments. Do you think legends like his ignite courage or merely terror? As dusk settled, the mist rolled through the valley once more, and with it the shadow of Diego Valverde stretched longer than life. Somewhere between memory and myth, his warning lingered, waiting for the next heartbeat of rebellion to awaken, or the next act of cruelty to rewrite history. Long after Diego Valverde's body had been claimed by the earth, the valley remained haunted, not by ghosts alone, but by a pervasive sense of dread that clung to walls, pathways, and fields like a second skin. The villagers could feel it in every cautious step, every hushed conversation, every glance toward the mountains where he had fallen. Even children, too young to remember the punishment firsthand, sensed the tension in the air, the way adults flinched at distant hoofbeats, the way the wind seemed to carry whispers of a man who had dared defy authority and suffered for it. Merchants and travelers spoke of unease upon entering the valley, describing an almost tangible weight pressing down on them. The mountains themselves seemed to absorb fear and defiance alike, exhaling it back as a chilling wind that rattled shutters and swept through narrow streets. Farmers worked their fields with mechanical precision, glancing over shoulders, as though Diego's shadow might descend upon them at any moment. His punishment had created a psychological landscape as oppressive as the physical one, where obedience was no longer a choice but instinct, and defiance carried the scent of inevitable doom. Yet within that fear the legend festered. Stories of Diego's courage circulated quietly, often whispered in churchyards or during long nights by the fire. Adults debated whether his end had been merely punishment or a moral statement. Some spoke in awe of his steadfastness, imagining themselves in his place. Others recoiled, certain that even a whisper of rebellion would bring the same wrath down upon them. The valley had become a theater of terror and reverence, where memory itself enforced the corregidor's authority. Psychologists and historians of later centuries would describe this as a textbook case of learned fear, a society conditioned to obey through spectacle and cruelty. But the human heart proved resilient. Admiration for Diego's bravery simmered quietly beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to ignite it. His death had become a warning, yes, but also a mirror, reflecting the choices every individual in the valley would face: survival through submission or moral courage at unimaginable cost. Would you have walked the valley in those years, feeling Diego's shadow at every step? Or would fear have forced silence and compliance? Comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Was his story a terror tactic or an enduring inspiration? As night fell and the wind whistled through jagged cliffs, a faint echo of hooves rolled across the valley once more. Diego's presence lingered, a psychological shadow whose influence refused to fade, waiting for the next choice, the next act of courage, or the next warning. The corregidor who ordered Diego Valverde's punishment remained a figure of absolute authority in the valley long after the event, his presence as oppressive as the stone walls of his manor. Villagers spoke his name in whispers, a mixture of fear and respect. Each decree he issued carried the weight of history and cruelty, reinforcing a culture where obedience was synonymous with survival. His influence extended beyond the immediate valley, reaching distant settlements, as tales of Diego's fate spread to warn others who might consider defiance. He meticulously curated the narrative of authority, ensuring that every act of punishment became part of the valley's collective memory. Reports were sent to Lima, letters exchanged with fellow officials, and tales exaggerated to cement his reputation. as an unwavering enforcer of law. He understood the power of spectacle. Public punishment was more than retribution. It was pedagogy, a lesson in obedience. Yet his legacy was paradoxical. While he intended terror, Diego's courage inadvertently became immortal, a counterpoint to his iron rule. The corregidor's story became inseparable from Diego's, a cautionary tale where cruelty and defiance were entwined. Villagers adapted to his rule with ritualized fear. Marketplaces hushed at his passing, homes were shuttered at the first sound of approaching riders, and whispers of rebellion became carefully coded messages. Despite the harshness, the corregidor's decisions shaped the valley, creating a society hyper-aware of authority, where every action, no matter how small, carried potential consequence. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, the echo of hooves and shouts bouncing off cliffs to remind residents that compliance was expected. Yet history has a way of twisting legacies. While the corregidor sought to erase Diego's influence, the rebel's story grew stronger with every retelling. Diego became a symbol of resistance, and the corregidor's name, though feared, was inseparable from the tale of the man who refused to bow. Generations later, scholars would debate whether the corregidor's legacy was one of unassailable authority or a chilling example of how cruelty can immortalize the very thing it seeks to destroy. Would you have respected such authority or dared to challenge it? Tell me in the comments. Was the corregidor a master of power or merely the architect of his own legend's shadow? As twilight draped the mountains in deep blue, the wind carried a faint, almost imperceptible echo of hooves and defiance. Diego's story and the corregidor's cruel shadow lingered together, shaping every heartbeat in the valley, and no one could escape the weight of their intertwined legacies. Even years after Diego Valverde's death, the mountains carried his story like a secret hum, traveling through hidden paths and secluded valleys where the corregidor's authority was strongest. Villagers who had once bowed in fear now passed subtle messages of courage from one family to another, whispered warnings, coded gestures, and clandestine gatherings beneath the shadow of ancient stone ruins. The scent of smoke from hidden fires mingled with the crisp mountain air, carrying both warmth and secrecy, as if the wind itself conspired to protect these acts of quiet rebellion. Despite the pervasive fear instilled by Diego's fate, small acts of defiance began to re-emerge. Shepherds would leave grazing lands untended, just long enough to signal solidarity. Women would hide food and tools from collectors as discreet statements of resistance. The youngest among them, inspired by whispered tales of Diego's courage, would mimic his stance in secret, standing tall and unbowed, if only for a fleeting moment, before the inevitable return to compliance. The valley had learned to balance survival with the silent remembrance of valor, preserving his spirit through subtle gestures and unspoken codes. Travelers passing through the region would occasionally hear murmurs of the man who faced the horses in taverns, in markets, and near churchyards. Some dismissed it as superstition, a ghost story to frighten children. Yet the villagers knew the truth. Diego's defiance had not ended with his death. It lingered, alive in the quiet, waiting for the next spark. Every whisper was a rebellion against the memory of fear, a reminder that courage could exist even under the shadow of cruelty. This duality, terror and inspiration, shaped the valley's culture for generations. Scholars would later describe it as a society suspended between obedience and resistance, where stories of the fallen hero ensured that moral courage remained alive, even under oppressive rule. The mountains themselves seemed to hum with memory, as if Diego's spirit walked unseen, carrying the weight of his warning while silently urging others to rise, even if only briefly. If you were in the valley, would you have dared to pass along such whispers knowing the danger? Or would fear have forced silence? Comment below. I want to hear your theory. Do whispered acts of defiance matter more than open rebellion? As night crept over jagged cliffs, the wind carried an almost imperceptible rhythm of hooves, a haunting reminder that Diego's story and the courage it inspired refused to be silenced. Long after the dust had settled and the hooves had faded into memory, Diego Valverde's punishment remained etched into the consciousness of the valley. Stones bore faint scratches from the chaos, fields were forever marked by hoofprints pressed deep into the earth, and the air carried the lingering metallic tang of fear that no rainfall could wash away. Every sunrise reminded villagers that rebellion bore consequences, yet in the same rising sun, some saw the ghost of defiance shimmering across cliffs where Diego had stood, unbowed. Merchants, priests, and travelers spoke cautiously of the valley, recounting the tale as both warning and legend. Diego's story became a moral compass, a cautionary tale delivered with surgical precision. The corrupt would be punished, but so too would the courageous who dared oppose authority. Children were taught about his bravery in whispers. Adults discussed it in hushed tones, balancing reverence with dread. The valley had transformed into a living monument to the duality of power and principle, where obedience and courage coexisted uneasily. Nature itself seemed to preserve the warning. Storms would erupt over the cliffs, wind howling as though echoing the thunder of hooves from that fateful day. Travelers reported hearing faint hoofbeats when walking through narrow passes at night, a phenomenon that the villagers neither confirmed nor denied, allowing fear and legend to grow hand in hand. Diego's punishment had become more than a single act of cruelty. It had become an enduring symbol, a visceral reminder that defiance had both nobility and danger. Historians later noted the psychological impact on generations. Children grew into adults mindful of authority, yet secretly inspired by Diego's courage. The story of one man torn apart by horses was more effective than any decree, any lecture, any law. It became a shadow over the valley, shaping morality, courage, and survival instincts in ways no ruler could have anticipated. Would you have remembered Diego's story, or let fear silence your conscience? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do warnings like this ensure compliance, or do they inspire courage in secret? As twilight fell and shadows stretched across the rugged landscape, the valley remained haunted by a single truth. Diego's death had been violent, deliberate, and horrifying, but it had also become immortal. The lesson lingered, an indelible mark on stone, soil, and human memory, whispering to all who dared to listen. Generations later, the valley still whispered Diego Valverde's name. Though the corregidor and his enforcers had long vanished into history, the mountains retained the memory of that terrible day. The soil, scarred with hoofprints and stained with blood, seemed almost to remember every detail of the punishment. Travelers who dared pass through the narrow passes often felt a chill, a subtle pressure on their shoulders, as if Diego's courage and suffering had merged into the very landscape, an echo that refused to fade. Stories told by elders carried the weight of truth and legend. Children grew up learning of a man who defied authority and paid the ultimate price. His fate a warning and an inspiration intertwined. Even the simplest actions, walking through fields, tending animals, passing under the cliffs, were influenced by the memory of that day. The valley had become a living monument to courage and cruelty, a place where the boundaries between fear and admiration blurred, and where every generation faced the silent question, would they obey or resist? Travelers' tales described faint hoofbeats at dusk, the rustle of cloaks in empty streets, the echo of a man's defiant cry carried on the wind. Scholars later suggested it was psychological, a manifestation of fear and memory. But for the villagers it was a tangible reminder. Defiance leaves a mark that authority cannot erase. Diego's story had transcended his body, becoming immortal in collective consciousness, a warning and a legend coexisting in the same breath. Yet in this echo there was hope. For every shadow of fear, there was a spark of courage. For every whispered warning, there was the lesson of moral resolve. Diego's life and death had become a mirror, reflecting the difficult choices every human must face when confronting injustice, survival through submission or courage through consequence. Would you have dared to walk these valleys carrying his story in your heart? Or would fear have forced silence? Comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Diego's defiance was folly or heroism? As the sun sank behind the jagged peaks, the wind carried one last haunting echo, the rhythmic pounding of phantom hooves, a defiance that refused to die. Diego Valverde's story remained, not merely as memory, but as a perpetual warning etched into mountains, soil, and human conscience. In the Andes his courage endures, whispering across generations. Some defiance cannot be silenced.